There's a certain quiet in Brooklyn at night. Even the crime seems to walk slower after midnight. The air has a chill that isn't quite cold, but it's sharp, like the breath of a man who knows what he's done and doesn't regret it. In a dim little apartment on 21st Street, the walls remembered things no one else did. Gunshots behind laughter, screams tucked between sports games on the TV, the silence of a man who never had to shout to be terrifying. Anthony Casso was born in 1942, but the night you're hearing about, he's not a baby. He's already become something else, something darker, a thing Brooklyn made, then tried to forget. But let's go back, just a little, slowly. Anthony's father, Michael Casso, was a longshoreman, a man who worked the docks not for money, not really, but for the whispers. He knew which crates to open and which ones to pretend not to see. He wore grease on his fingers like most men wore watches, with quiet pride. Young Anthony used to follow his father to the Brooklyn docks, not every day, just enough to smell the salt, to feel the weight of the crates, to learn who got paid and who got pushed off the pier. There were rules back then, unwritten ones. You didn't cheat the wrong man, you didn't run your mouth, and you never, ever took something unless you could kill to keep it. Anthony was a smart kid, but not in the way teachers liked. He was good at watching, at remembering faces, and he never forgot an insult, not once. He had a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. People used to say he looked like he was always planning something, even when he was just staring out a window. The streets were his first classroom. By the time he was 16, he had already been arrested for burglary. But he wasn't sloppy. He never left fingerprints, and he never took more than he needed, just enough to keep his name quiet but his wallet warm. Then came the 60s. The suits got sharper, the cars got louder, and the Mafia, it was no longer a shadow. It was the sun. Anthony joined the Lucchese crime family like most men joined the army, without question. He didn't need convincing. He already knew what loyalty cost and what it bought. The Lucchese family wasn't the biggest, but they were smart, strategic. They didn't just shoot people, they erased them. Gas pipe, that's what they called him, because of a pipe he once used to beat a man who lied. One hit wasn't enough. He hit him until the man wasn't a man anymore. And Anthony didn't blink. That was the difference. Lots of men killed. Only a few enjoyed it. People said he had a thing in his head, a crack or a burn, something missing or maybe something extra. Whatever it was, it made him dangerous. Even Paulie Vario, his early mentor, the same guy who helped Henry Hill, said Anthony was useful, but you had to watch him. He'd smile while cutting your throat. He moved up fast, quieter than Gotti, less flashy than the others, but somehow scarier. Because Anthony didn't want to be loved, he wanted to be remembered. He started running extortion rackets, then drugs. He fixed bids in the construction world. He planted bombs. He ordered hits. He made men disappear like they were never born. But at night, and this part you won't find in the history books, Anthony Casso couldn't sleep. He'd lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, tracing the cracks like they were roads to hell. Sometimes he heard voices, sometimes he saw faces. Mostly he just lit another cigarette and waited for morning. His wife said he ground his teeth in his sleep. Sometimes he'd wake up gasping, drenched in sweat, saying nothing. There were rumors, whispers among soldiers and capos, that the man they feared most feared the dark. But who would dare ask him? He was the kind of man who'd give you a ride, crack a joke, and then drive you into the river, smiling the whole way. Still, the nights kept getting longer, and the ghosts kept getting louder. They said Anthony Casso could walk into a room and silence it just by standing there. Not because he was big, he wasn't. He wasn't tall, didn't wear fancy suits like Gotti, didn't flash jewelry or drive Ferraris. But when his eyes landed on you, you felt like you were already being judged, and the sentence had already been written. But back then, in the late 60s, he was still learning the language of fear, still watching how a look, a whisper, a gesture could decide who lived and who vanished. He didn't talk much, never wasted words. If he had something to say, it was said softly, like a warning wrapped in velvet. There was this bakery on Avenue U. Nothing fancy, just good bread, strong coffee, and a back room where things were decided. Anthony used to sit there with old-timers, soaking in every word like gospel. He watched how men asked for favors with eyes down and hands trembling. He listened to how debts were discussed in riddles, how forgiveness came only after a price was paid in blood. By 25, Anthony wasn't just a soldier, he was a weapon, a man used when problems refused to disappear politely. He knew how to follow orders, but more importantly, he knew when to ignore them. That's what made him dangerous. See, most guys in the life had a line they wouldn't cross. Family, friends, kids, something. Anthony had no line, no conscience, no voice whispering, maybe not this one. He once told someone, a junkie looking to impress, "You only live scared if you got something to lose. I don't lose sleep. I take it from others." And he meant it. There was a story about a loan shark who crossed the family, took a few envelopes that didn't belong to him. Big mistake. Paulie Vario, who was still the boss of that crew at the time, wanted him handled quietly. No mess, just a lesson. Anthony had another idea. He waited for the man to come home from his mistress's apartment, followed him 3 blocks in silence, then grabbed him by the back of the neck and smashed his head into a brick wall until his body slid down like a dropped coat. He whispered, "You steal from us, you bleed into the ground you walk on." And then he left the man alive, just barely. It wasn't mercy. It was a warning that breathed. People talked. They said Anthony didn't just punish. He crafted fear, turned it into art. Soon, he wasn't just taking orders, he was giving them. Not officially, not yet. But people started checking in with him before making moves. Even made guys, even captains. He had a sharp memory. If you ever crossed him, even in something as simple as speaking over him at dinner, he remembered. Might not say a word. Might even shake your hand afterward. But months later, you'd find yourself standing beside a dumpster with a gun pointed at your teeth, and you'd have no idea why. He'd remember. That was the thing with Anthony. He was patient. He believed revenge was best served scalding, not cold. And then came the big one, the mob wars. See, New York in the 80s wasn't a chessboard anymore. It was a minefield. Families were turning in on themselves. Guys were flipping. The feds were everywhere, wearing wires under their suits, making deals behind dark glass in offices where voices were recorded but never raised. The Lucchese family was strong, smart, but not immune. That's when Anthony rose higher, not because he craved power, but because someone had to protect what was left. Him and Vic Amuso, they made a pair. Vic was boss in name. Anthony was the flame under the pot. Together, they decided the old ways were too soft. There would be no forgiveness, no second chances. You crossed them, you died. And the death wouldn't be clean. There was a contractor from Staten Island, honest guy, tried to go legit, but one of their shell companies had money tied up in his project, and he tried to pull out. Anthony had him picked up, tied to a chair, and tortured for 2 days. No questions, no shouting. Just pain. When they finally put a bullet in his head, the body was dumped off the Belt Parkway like yesterday's garbage. Why? To remind the others, you don't get out clean. The murders started piling up like dirty laundry. Mob guys, associates, friends, even if family. Anthony didn't care. If you were a threat, or even a whisper of one, you were gone. But here's the part no one ever talks about, the cost of carrying that kind of violence. Even for a man like him. He'd come home and sit in the dark sometimes, didn't like lights, said they gave him headaches. He'd pour himself a scotch, stare at the floor, and just sit there. Hours, not moving, not blinking. Sometimes his wife would hear him mumbling to himself in the middle of the night. Sometimes he'd get up, check the locks 5 times, then sit at the edge of the bed breathing heavy like he'd just outrun something that was gaining. She asked him once, "Do you have nightmares?" He looked at her like she was stupid. "No, I give 'em." But his hands were shaking. See, fear doesn't always show up in screams or sobs. Sometimes it looks like a man who can't sit still. A man who stops answering the phone. A man who checks the mirror too often. Anthony had made a kingdom out of paranoia. He started bugging his own guys' phones, had secret cameras installed in meeting spots. He even had cops on the payroll, 2 of them, feeding him names, dates, surveillance files, detectives, real ones, feeding a madman inside info. He called them his crystal balls. He paid them well, envelopes thick enough to buy silence, fear, and forgetfulness. But deep down, he didn't trust them either. Anthony didn't trust anyone, because how could he? He knew what betrayal looked like. He'd orchestrated it too many times. He had sat across from men he called brothers, and smiled, while already having their deaths written on napkins in his coat pocket. He'd ordered hits on people who helped raise him, people who once gave him advice, food, shelter, gone. Just like that. Because power has a price, and Anthony Casso paid it in pieces of his soul. If you believe he had one. One day, his mother died, and Anthony didn't go to the funeral. He said, "Too many eyes can't be seen." But those who knew him said that wasn't the reason. They said he couldn't face the idea of anything innocent dying, because it reminded him that he'd never be innocent again. There's a photo, grainy, old, of Anthony standing alone at her grave 2 weeks later. No flowers, no hat. Just him, looking down, hands in pockets, face blank. You look at that photo long enough, and you start to wonder, was he mourning? Or just checking to make sure she stayed down? He once said, "The dead are easy. It's the living you gotta worry about." And as the years passed, he started worrying more. More locks, more security. He moved like a hunted animal, kept a second car parked 5 blocks away, just in case. His sleep got worse. He started using pills, not street junk, but prescription stuff, mixed with scotch, just enough to blur the edges. But the dreams kept slipping through. Faces he'd forgotten, voices he'd silenced, rooms full of blood. He told a guy once, someone close, "Sometimes I wake up and I don't know if I'm alive or just still stuck in a memory." And the guy didn't know what to say. What could you say to a man who had built a life out of ending others? Even the Lucchese family started getting nervous. Anthony was too volatile, too paranoid, too willing to kill. There were whispers. Maybe he was losing it. Maybe the flame that made him so powerful was starting to burn through his own skin. But no one dared challenge him. Because even broken, Anthony was lethal. He didn't fall with a whimper. He fell with sirens, headlines, betrayals. But that part's still coming. For now, just know this, as the city moved forward, changing, pulsing, pretending it had cleaned up, there was still one man sitting in a dark apartment, half awake, half insane, counting ghosts instead of sheep. By the early 1980s, New York had 2 faces. There was the one you saw in the movies, sharp suits, flashy clubs, Wall Street arrogance. And then there was the one hidden beneath, cracked sidewalks, backroom murders, deals made in whispers, and men like Anthony Casso pulling invisible strings. He wasn't just a gangster now. He was a ghost in a city full of living targets. Vic Amuzzo was the official boss of the Lucchese family. Yes, but everyone knew who really held the blade. It was Anthony, Gaspipe. And what a name it was. He'd earned it young, back when he used a length of lead pipe to turn a loudmouth into a memory. He never liked guns much, said they were too quick. He liked work, the kind that left stains behind. But now, Anthony didn't have to touch anyone. He had soldiers for that. Teams, button men, shooters, cleaners. He could make a call, and a man would be erased before the coffee in his cup went cold. And yet, the more powerful he became, the more unstable he grew. Sleep evaded him entirely now. He'd close his eyes and find himself back in that basement on Ocean Parkway, where one of his victims, an informant who begged too long, had died, gagged and shaken. In the dream, the man was always alive again, always choking on blood and spit, always reaching out, pleading. Anthony would wake up covered in sweat, gripping the sheets like they were throats. He stopped sleeping in his bed, started using the couch, then the floor. Said it kept the dreams less real. He began carrying 2 guns instead of 1, kept one taped under the bathroom sink, another under the dashboard of his Cadillac. He wore body armor beneath his shirts. This wasn't fear, at least not the kind regular men felt. This was paranoia mixed with power, a deadly blend. And still, he functioned. He wasn't just surviving, he was thriving. The construction rackets were booming. Garbage hauling was locked down. Union leaders were being paid off or beaten into silence. He made tens of millions, quietly, efficiently, and with every dollar that came in, another name disappeared. See, Anthony had a list, not on paper, never that stupid. But in his mind, there was always a list, people who needed to be handled. Some were rats, some were weak, some just looked at him the wrong way. He once had a guy clipped just for being too nervous. Said, "If you're twitching around me, you're hiding something. I don't wait to find out what." That was Anthony's world. A world where trust didn't exist, only usefulness. He ran the Lucchese family like a war machine. His favorite tactic? The surprise visit. He'd show up unannounced at a sit-down, lean against the wall, and say nothing for 10 minutes. Just watch. Let the silence stretch. Let the other guy sweat. Then maybe he'd smile, maybe he'd ask for a drink, or maybe he'd have someone take the guy outside and break his fingers one at a time. You never knew. And that's what made him terrifying. Not what he did, but that you couldn't predict it. Even his closest allies began watching their backs. Frank Spaghetti DeGrazio, a made guy from Queens, once said, "Gas pipe loved you in the morning, and by dinner your mother was picking out a coffin." But what really made things dark, darker than the murders, the betrayals, the blood, was Anthony's relationship with the police. He didn't just bribe low-level guys. He had two high-ranking NYPD detectives on his payroll, Stephen Caracappa and Louis Ippolito. You might have heard the names. If not, remember them. Because what Anthony did with them, that broke the rules of the street and the law. These weren't just cops looking the other way. They were killers, paid assassins, moonlighting as detectives while taking lives for the mob. Anthony called them my crystal balls. He'd say, "They show me the future. Who's talking? Who's watching? Who needs to disappear?" They fed him case files, surveillance logs, FBI informant lists. They tailed targets. They pulled guys over, handcuffed them, and drove them to their execution sites. Real cops, with real badges, helping a real psychopath clean house. With them by his side, Anthony became untouchable. If someone flipped, he knew within hours. If someone lied, their bodies were found in trunks before the lie could finish echoing. One day, a guy named Eddie Lino, a suspected Gambino turncoat, ended up dead on the Belt Parkway, shot behind the wheel in what looked like a traffic stop gone wrong. It wasn't. It was Gas Pipe's cops. He paid them $75,000 for that one, said they earned it. And still, despite all the blood, the bodies, the money, he wasn't sleeping. Not truly. He took to sitting outside at night on a folding chair in the backyard of a safe house in Long Island, a dog at his feet, a pistol in his lap, a bottle of scotch in his hand. He'd stare at the moon and mutter names, names only he remembered, names of the dead. He once said to his bodyguard, "The more people I kill, the closer they feel, like they're in the trees watching me." The bodyguard didn't answer. What could he say? You don't comfort a man who turned his own friends into fish food. You just nod and hope your name doesn't end up whispered under the stars. But even with all his madness, Anthony was still strategic. He and Amuso had made a decision. They would rule through fear. No diplomacy, no soft talk, just swift death for any sign of disloyalty. Even other mob families grew cautious. The Gambinos were rattled. The Genovese family called them the rabid dogs. And within their own family, guys were disappearing fast, made men, good earners. If Anthony suspected you of weakness or even of hesitating to kill, you were gone. He once said, "Loyalty isn't about what you say. It's about what you do when I tell you to burn a friend." And he tested that. Ordered hits on men who had godchildren with the shooter, just to see what they'd do. Those who hesitated died too. And somewhere, in the middle of all this bloodshed, the FBI began to circle tighter. They didn't know the half of it, not yet, but bodies were stacking up, and informants were flipping faster than ever. Anthony knew it, felt it. He started rotating safe houses, changed cars weekly, spoke only in code. Never stayed anywhere more than 2 nights in a row. He became a ghost in his own city. But ghosts don't sleep, and Anthony was slipping. He stopped trusting Amuzo, started thinking maybe Vic would turn on him. Maybe the boss didn't like how big he'd gotten, how feared he'd become. Maybe he was already setting Anthony up to take the fall. He started tailing his own boss, had his men watch Vic's house, check who he was talking to. Paranoia had fully taken root. The killer who once walked boldly into restaurants, kissed babies, cracked jokes, he was now a shadow behind tinted windows, mumbling to himself, planning his own boss's murder just in case. Even his wife noticed. She told her sister, "He talks to people who aren't there. He asks me the same question 3 times in a row like he forgot the answer. I think he's slipping." But she didn't say it to him. She wouldn't dare. And still the city turned. Still the streets pulsed with life and fear and ambition. But Anthony Casso, the gas pipe, he was stuck in a spiral of power and panic. Killing didn't quiet the noise anymore. Money didn't calm the dreams. Not even the scotch helped much now. And so he walked. At night, alone, just him, the sidewalk, and the ghosts. Always the ghosts. The fall came slowly, like the last light bleeding out of the sky. Not a gunshot, not a siren, not even a betrayal. Yet, just quiet shifts in air pressure, whispers behind walls, and the slow unraveling of a man who thought he couldn't be touched. Anthony Casso still moved like a boss, still made money, still barked orders into payphones with cold authority, still had men cleaning his cars with toothbrushes, still had lieutenants looking at their shoes when he entered a room. But something had changed. It began, oddly, with his hands. He'd always been precise, deliberate, the kind of man who wiped down a gun 3 times even if he wore gloves. But now, his fingers trembled. Subtle at first, just enough to mess with his signature. He started avoiding paperwork, told his guys to sign for him. "My time's better spent thinking," he'd say. But everyone could tell he didn't like holding pens anymore. He also stopped shaking hands, said it was flu season. But men like Gaspipe didn't worry about viruses. They worried about ghosts clinging to their skin. He'd go into his own office now and leave the lights off, sit in the dark, breathing through his nose like a wolf just before a hunt. He told one guy, a younger soldier trying too hard to impress, to sit with him in silence for 15 minutes, not a word, just breathing. At the end of it, Anthony turned and said, "That's how I know if I can trust a man. Who talks first?" The kid nodded, trying to smile. He was found dead 2 months later, thrown down a stairwell in Bensonhurst. No one knew why. Or maybe everyone did. The quiet was getting louder inside Anthony's head. But the world outside, it was screaming. The feds were circling closer. More arrests, more wiretaps, more flipping. The commission trial had crippled the 5 families. Guys were taking pleas like never before. It wasn't just rats anymore. It was full-grown wolves turning on their packs. Gaspipe hated rats more than anything, not just because they'd betrayed the code, but because rats didn't die clean. They ran, they hid, they got deals. He believed in punishment, not survival. He believed blood should answer betrayal, and now he was drowning in betrayal. He'd walk into restaurants and see empty chairs, guys who were away or missing or worse, cooperating. Every week another guy vanished, some into the wind, some into the arms of the government. He started carrying 3 guns, 1 on his hip, 1 in his boot, and 1 in the glove box of whatever car he was switching to that week. Sometimes he'd walk out of a sit-down and whisper to himself, "They're all dead already, just don't know it yet." And in a way, he was right. The Lucchese family was eating itself. Vic Amuso was getting paranoid too, and when 2 bosses lose their minds at the same time, the blood starts flowing in every direction. Anthony and Vic decided to hold a meeting, an important one. Not in Brooklyn, too hot, not in Manhattan, too risky. They chose Scranton, Pennsylvania, of all places. Quiet, forgettable. A place where no one asked questions. The plan was simple. Gather the top guys, talk strategy, reassure loyalty. But something happened. The night before the meeting, one of the captains, Joey DeSantis, disappeared. Vanished. Left his hotel room and never came back. Anthony was furious, said someone tipped off the feds, said maybe Joey flipped, maybe others too. The meeting never happened. Instead, bodies started dropping like fruit from a dying tree. Guys who were at that hotel, most didn't live to see winter. Anthony didn't wait for proof anymore. Proof was for courts. He once said, "In this life, if I think you're guilty, that's the verdict." And so he started cleaning house, not just enemies, friends, guys he broke bread with, guys who stood at his wedding, guys who once called him brother, dead. He began suspecting everyone. He even turned on Vic, started mumbling about how the boss was too soft now, how he might make a deal, how maybe he needed to go. Anthony talked to two of his most trusted guys about it. One of them vanished, the other got promoted. That's how the game worked now. He started calling himself the insurance policy. Said if anyone tried to turn, he'd take them all down first. One night, during a sit-down, someone asked him what he'd do if he got arrested. He smiled, said, "They'll never take me alive. I'll go out like a man, gun in hand, smile on my face." Everyone laughed, too loud, too forced, but his eyes didn't laugh. They stayed still, watching, and that night, he didn't go home. He drove for 4 hours, no destination, just road, just thoughts, just the company of silence and the familiar weight of a loaded pistol resting beside him. He ended up in Jersey, parked by the Hudson, watching the city lights flicker in the water like dying stars. And he whispered to himself, "If I jump, do they follow?" No one saw him that night, but he sat there till sunrise, alone, the king of nothing. Because by then, he had it all: money, reputation, power, and yet nothing felt safe. He didn't feel real anymore. He'd talk to himself in mirrors, start conversations in the middle of silence, heard knocks on doors that never opened. Even his dog started avoiding him. One night, a soldier said something offhand, something small, like a joke. Anthony didn't laugh, just stared at him. 12 seconds of silence, then nodded. The man was dead within a week. Word got around. Even other families began worrying. A capo from the Genovese family said, "Gas pipe ain't running a family. He's running a graveyard." Still, no one dared challenge him, because even in madness he was lethal. And then, the walls cracked. Late 1990. The feds finally came knocking, not loud, just persistent. Indictments, subpoenas, informants, and then, the real shock. Vic Amuso vanished, disappeared. Some say he ran. Some say he got tipped off. Some say Anthony helped him disappear. And then started whispering to others that he'd take over. Power shifts quietly in the Mafia, not with announcements, but with eye contact. And Anthony started making those eyes. He began acting like the boss, calling shots, reassigning crews. Even started talking about peace, but his kind of peace always smelled like fresh blood. Guys began to fall in line. Better to follow a madman than to become his next nightmare. But the FBI, they were closer than ever. And Anthony? He still wasn't sleeping, not a minute. His eyes were bloodshot. He lost weight, started muttering in meetings. He'd say things like, "I saw Carlo last night. He was smiling, said I'm next." Problem is, Carlo had been dead for years. The ghosts were talking louder now. Names, faces, regrets. His past wasn't chasing him. It was standing right beside him, every day, every night. He told one of his mistresses, "I hear things when it's too quiet. That's why I keep the TV on, even when I ain't watching." The woman didn't know what to say. She just kept pouring his drink. Anthony wasn't a man anymore. He was a fuse, burning fast, and the explosion was coming. By 1991, the silence between gunshots had gotten shorter. Men were dying fast, not just enemies, allies. And behind every whispered hit, every body found in a trunk or rolled in a carpet, there was one name on everyone's lips: Casso. He had become the reaper in the 5 boroughs, a ghost with a ledger, keeping score with bullets, balancing fear against loyalty. But now, something was changing. Not outside. Not yet. Inside. Something tight in his chest that wouldn't unclench. A sound in his head, low and constant, like a warning bell underwater. And the weight of it all, was starting to show. He moved differently now, not weaker, but heavier. Like a man dragging invisible chains behind him, the street still respected him, feared him. But behind closed doors, even the most seasoned mobsters were beginning to ask each other, how long until gas pipe breaks? Because the walls were closing in. The FBI had built a fortress of files, wiretaps, turncoats, surveillance. They didn't knock anymore. They pried. And the biggest surprise of all, the Lucchese family was imploding from within. Vic Amuso, once Casso's partner in chaos, had disappeared, vanished into thin air after learning he was being indicted. Rumors swirled. Some said Vic had fled to Mexico. Others said he was hiding in Pennsylvania. A few claimed Casso had arranged for him to vanish permanently. But the truth, Vic had gone underground to avoid arrest. Casso took the reins in his absence, unofficially, of course. But in the mob, power doesn't wait for permission. He began directing the family like a paranoid general at war. Everyone was a suspect. Every whisper felt like a gun being cocked. He called sit-downs just to look into men's eyes, asked meaningless questions, not for the answers, but for the reactions. You hear anything on Frankie? You seen Joey lately? What's your gut tell you about Sal? And depending on your blink, your tone, your sweat, you might walk out, or never be seen again. Casso had crossed a line most wise guys feared to approach. He used cops to kill. And not just any cops, Stephen Caracappa and Louis Ippolito, two NYPD detectives with Sicilian blood and blue uniforms. On paper, they were heroes, decorated, respected. One had even worked in organized crime intelligence. But in truth, they were Gaspipe's private death squad. He paid them a retainer, tens of thousands of dollars, and in return, they handed over FBI files, tracked informants, and when asked, pulled the trigger themselves. Real cops, real guns, real bodies. The contract hit on Eddie Lino, a feared Gambino mobster, was the most brazen. Caracappa and Ippolito pulled Lino over on the Belt Parkway pretending to be cops doing a traffic stop. And then they executed him in cold blood, right there in his car, and drove off like nothing happened. It was shocking, even in a world where bodies dropped weekly. But to Anthony, it was art. He believed in control, and this was the highest form. To own not just the street, but the men meant to protect it. He once bragged, "With my 2 cops, I could kill anyone I wanted, no questions asked." And it was true, for a time. But nothing that bloody stays hidden forever. Meanwhile, Casso's sleep was nearly gone. Even the pills didn't help now. He'd lie awake for hours, staring at the shadows on the ceiling, thinking about the men he'd had buried in landfills, dumped in marshes, or dismembered in warehouses. Not because he regretted it, but because some part of him thought they were coming back. He told his driver one night, "I see faces, Lou. Faces of guys we tossed years ago. Sometimes I think if I open my closet, one will be standing there, bleeding all over my shoes." Lou didn't answer, just drove. They all knew better than to answer when Gaspipe started talking to the air. By late '91, the FBI had what they needed. They had flipped a high-level Lucchese captain. They had hundreds of pages of surveillance. They had phone logs, names, addresses, even partial recordings. And finally, on January 19th, 1993, the hunt ended. Anthony Casso was arrested in Mount Olive, New Jersey, in a modest house under a false identity. No gunfight, no glory, no grand last stand. Just a silent surrender. The man who once said he'd never be taken alive was cuffed without a word. His empire had finally caught up with him. But this is where the story takes a darker turn, because most men, even killers, when arrested, flip out. They rage, panic, beg. But not Anthony. He was quiet, calm, too calm. They processed him, booked him, threw him in a cell in MCC, New York, a federal lockup downtown. And still, he said nothing. For days, then weeks. His lawyers visited, tried to talk strategy. He barely spoke. One of them said he looked like a machine on standby, just waiting for someone to plug him back in. But in his head, Anthony Casso was calculating, and what he came up with was something nobody expected. He flipped. The unthinkable. Gas pipe, the enforcer, the executioner, the man who hated rats, became one. In 1994, after over a year behind bars, Casso contacted the government and said 6 words that shocked the Mafia world. "I want to cooperate with you." The feds were stunned. This was no small-time capo. This was a man who had ordered or committed dozens of murders. By his own count, over 36. He gave up everything. Details on how the Lucchese family worked. Names of soldiers, captains, corrupt cops. He even exposed Caracappa and Ippolito, his pet detectives. For a brief moment, Anthony Casso became the government's greatest asset. But it wouldn't last, because Anthony wasn't built for loyalty, not to the street and not to the law. He grew arrogant, started threatening other inmates while in protective custody, demanded special treatment, spoke to other wise guys when he wasn't supposed to, lied about details. And worse, he bragged, told stories with pride, described murders like bedtime tales, laughed about torture, smiled while remembering the good old days. The government realized what they had brought into their house, a monster, not just a criminal, a man who had no remorse, no shame, no soul. And in 1998, the Department of Justice dropped him as a cooperator. That almost never happens. But Anthony Casso had managed to do the impossible. He got kicked out of witness protection. After that, he was transferred to ADX Florence, the federal supermax in Colorado. No more deals, no more options, just concrete, steel, and silence. And there he sat, gas pipe. Once the most feared man in New York, now locked in a box, staring at the wall. He lived for over 2 more decades, never got out, never made peace, never found sleep. In 2020, while the world above him fought a different kind of war, the COVID-19 pandemic, Anthony Casso caught the virus. And on December 15, 2020, after years of health problems, the man who couldn't sleep finally closed his eyes forever. But death didn't clean his name. Even now, when you mention gas pipe in certain parts of Brooklyn, men lower their voices. Old men still cross themselves. Because Casso didn't just kill. He dismantled people from the inside out, and he never looked back. It's the silence that lingers longest. After Anthony Casso died, the headlines came and went like they always do. One day he was on the front page, mob enforcer dies in Supermax, and the next day, forgotten beneath news about politics, a celebrity divorce, and a snowstorm hitting the Northeast. But in certain neighborhoods his name still echoed, not loud, not proud, just quiet, like a draft under the door, unwanted but impossible to ignore. Bensonhurst, Gravesend, Bay Ridge. South Brooklyn still wore the scars, though the paint had changed. The old diners were now smoothie bars. The street corners where deals once happened were now watched by cameras. The kids had no idea who Gaspipe was. But the old men remembered. They still sat outside their brick homes in plastic chairs, hands folded over canes, talking in half sentences, as if finishing a thought out loud might wake something dark from sleep. "Casso, now that guy, you didn't even have to cross him. Just be near someone who did." He made the other wise guys look like altar boys. They spoke like they were still watching him walk down the street, short, solid, shoulders tight, eyes scanning like radar. The kind of man who never walked behind anyone, even if he was 3 steps slower. That presence, it didn't die in prison. It didn't die with COVID. It lived in the rules that stayed behind. Unwritten laws shaped by men like him. Never rat, never speak out of turn, and never, never forget who you're dealing with. In the years after his fall, the Lucchese family limped along, not dead, not alive, just hollow. A name without teeth. The bodies had piled too high. The paranoia had spread too wide. Men like Gaspipe didn't just destroy enemies, they destroyed systems. He had built a house of fear, and when he disappeared, No one wanted to move back in. The younger guys that tried to revive the old ways, they weren't made for it. They liked money, yes, they liked respect, but they didn't like blood. Not the kind that stuck under your nails for days, not the kind that haunted your dreams. Gaspipe didn't dream. He relived, and he passed that down like a family curse. There was a story, no one knows if it's true, about a kid who found one of Anthony's old stash houses years after his arrest. He thought it was empty, just a dusty garage full of tools, until he pried open a locked cabinet in the floor. Inside were photos, notes, Polaroids of dead men, faces mangled, mouths open, a notebook full of addresses, payoffs, debts, and a single phrase written over and over in the back. Dead men can't talk, but they sure know how to stare. The kid turned the place over to police, moved out of state a week later. That's how legends are born, not with facts, but with fear that clings to your ribs and whispers when the lights go out. But there were still men in prison who remembered Casso in flesh, not memory. They sat in the yard, older now, faces leathered from time, and when his name came up, something shifted in their posture. Not respect, not hate, something heavier, like they were remembering a near-death experience. "You didn't play games with Gaspipe," one said. "He played alone. The rest of us were just pieces." He was never like Gotti, all flash and cameras and fake smiles. He wasn't like Gigante, pretending madness to dodge bullets in prison time. He was something else entirely. A man who believed in the rules when they worked for him, and burned them when they didn't. Inside the Supermax, they say he kept to himself, didn't talk much, didn't join the other Italians during rec time. Some guys claim he paced his cell for hours, muttering under his breath. Others say he spent days without speaking, just staring at the concrete wall like it owed him something. His body broke down before his mind did. Diabetes, heart issues, a damaged back. The years had turned the enforcer into a coughing shell, but that voice, that low sandpaper rasp, never lost its chill. When guards walked past his cell, he'd sometimes say things without looking at them. "You ever think about how easy it is to disappear? I used to pay guys like you. Now you lock me up. Your face looks familiar. Hope it's not from a photo I had." Half threats, half riddles, full impact. No one wanted to be on his tier. In those final years, the Bureau of Prisons barely acknowledged him. To them, he was just another aging gangster locked up on a pile of charges. No special attention, no interviews, no visitors. He was buried before he died. But when the virus came in 2020, it didn't care about bloodlines or body counts. It swept through the prisons like a rumor with claws. They moved him to a medical facility, tried to keep him isolated, but the damage was already done. He fought it, of course. Casso wasn't the type to go quiet. The nurses said he cursed them out in Italian and broken English, refused to eat, refused to die on their schedule. He made it all the way to December. And then, on the 15th, just after midnight, the man who once ran a criminal empire from a payphone took one last breath and slipped out of the world without ceremony. No funerals, no tears, no 21-gun salute, just a box, just numbers, just a file closed. But legends don't die in prison, they fester. He was gone, yes, but the things he did, the lives he broke, the rules he shattered, those stayed. Some say Gaspipe ruined the mob more than the feds ever could, because he made it personal, because he killed too many friends, because he didn't care about the future, only the moment. He was supposed to be the hammer. Instead, he cracked the foundation. Even Vic Amuzzo, hiding somewhere in the shadows, must have felt it. The betrayal, the rot. Vic would eventually get caught too, of course. That's how this life ends. In courtrooms, in coffins, there's no retirement plan, no sunset. Just names crossed off lists, just secrets buried deeper than bodies. Still, some men tried to salvage the old ways. One of them, an aging capo from the Bronx, said it best. Casso was the last real fear. After him, they stopped being afraid and started talking. Now, the code of silence, omerta, was paper thin. You couldn't trust your own cousin, your own best friend. you shook hands knowing someone in the room had a mic on. But in Casso's day, a man thought twice before lying. Because if he did, his fingers came off first. The brutality wasn't the point. The message was. The memory of what might happen. And that's what still lives in Brooklyn. In those cracked sidewalks, in the backs of barber shops, in the way old men look up when a black car drives slow past their stoop. Not respect, not nostalgia, fear. A legacy that clings like smoke. Because Anthony Casso wasn't a man you forgave. He was a name you tried not to say after dark, and if you did, you looked over your shoulder, just to be sure. He's dead, yes, but who's to say the things he did didn't leave echoes? Echoes don't die, they just wait to be heard again. And in certain corners of this city, when the streetlights flicker and the wind cuts just right, you can almost hear him laugh. After Gaspipe disappeared into federal custody, the streets didn't exhale. They held their breath. Because his absence didn't bring peace, it brought confusion. For decades, Casso had run his world with a kind of cruel efficiency. Every dollar flowed through hands he approved. Every killing was signed off with a glance, a nod, or nothing at all. Even his paranoia had a system to it. Now that system was gone. And what filled the vacuum wasn't order. It was chaos wearing respect's old clothes. Some tried to step up, second-tier captains, old enforcers, and new blood trying too hard to look cold. But they weren't him. They didn't carry the same weight. They gave orders and hoped. Anthony had never hoped. He decided. Guys like Sal, Three-Finger Manzone, tough, clever, connected, they saw the moment as a chance to climb. He started holding quiet meetings in the Bronx, trying to consolidate power, flashing cash around like it could erase fear. But fear doesn't disappear. It mutates. In the back rooms of social clubs, old-timers leaned closer, speaking softer. What would Gaspipe do if he were still out? Sal's too loud. Tony would have clipped him already. You think he left any messages behind? That last one was the question no one dared answer, because Casso was a planner, a man who never trusted the present to protect him. It was said he kept dead man's switches, files, notes, secrets. He once told a fellow capo, long gone now, "If I go, I'm still watching. You just won't know from where." So even in his absence, Anthony's presence remained, like a stain no mop could touch, like a prayer no priest would say aloud. And then, something strange happened. In early 1995, about a year after Casso began cooperating, sealed rumors started spreading. Federal agents had uncovered hidden documents during a broader sweep of Lucchese-connected businesses, storage units, offices, basements. Most were empty. Some had old betting slips, burner phones, coded ledgers. But one unit, registered to a shell company no one had ever heard of, had something different. Inside were photos, not the usual mugshots or surveillance stills. These were personal. Anthony with soldiers, Anthony shaking hands, Anthony laughing, a rare, chilling sight, dates written in pencil, names scribbled on the backs, and beneath them, a small wooden lockbox. They cracked it open to find a cassette tape, an old-school recorder, and a stack of unmarked envelopes. The tape? A single recording. Gaspipe's voice, calm, tired, eerily reflective. "If you're listening, then I'm either dead or close. Doesn't matter. You think taking me off the street ends it? I built this thing in layers. My hands are in every drawer. You can burn the house, but the ashes still carry my name." That tape never made it to trial. It was buried. Internal evidence. The Bureau didn't want to create a myth, didn't want the public hearing a mass murderer speak like a king from exile. But word leaked anyway. It always does. And in the streets, that tape became a legend, a whispered prophecy. Some believed Anthony left behind kill orders, a dead man's kill list, people who had wronged him, rats, traitors, maybe even friends. Others said it was just theater, one final mind game. But the fear returned. A few guys vanished that spring. One got shot walking out of a deli in Ozone Park. Another turned up in a trunk near Pelham Bay. Nothing tied back to Casso. Why would it? He was locked in a box 1,000 miles away. But still, the timing. One guy, an old bookmaker named Frankie Rio, turned himself in for unrelated charges just to avoid the streets. Said in court, "I ain't afraid of jail. I'm afraid of ghosts with good memories." He didn't have to say the name. Everyone knew what ghost he meant. Meanwhile, the Lucchese family was rotting from the inside. Vic Amuzzo had been caught by then. They grabbed him in Scranton in 1991 after nearly 2 years on the run. He kept control for a while from inside prison, issuing orders through intermediaries, but his voice grew weaker with each year. The family fractured into smaller cliques, some loyal to Amuzzo, some loyal to the idea of Casso, and some who just wanted to survive. And survival didn't look like it used to. No more full envelopes every week, no more protection from the law. The unions were fading, the old rackets were drying up, street corners were overrun by new crews. Albanians, Russians, younger, hungrier, less tied to tradition. Guys like Casso had ruled because the world respected the code. But now, the code was a story, a bedtime tale, something your uncle told you over wine. And yet, Casso's shadow still moved. Even in prison, he made noise. His cooperation stalled. His temper returned. He threatened other witnesses, mouthed off to guards, disrespected prosecutors. The government dropped him as a cooperator in '98, called him unmanageable. How fitting. A man who once managed an empire so tightly that even his smiles were suspicious, now labeled unmanageable by the very people he tried to buy his freedom from. And still, he didn't break. He withdrew, hardened, wrote letters to no one, refused interviews, refused family visits, told his own blood not to come. He wasn't preparing for release anymore. He was preparing for immortality. He knew what men like him became. Not legends, not martyrs, warnings. You could feel it if you walked past his cell in Florence ADX. Guards said he barely spoke, didn't eat much, slept sitting up, refused books unless they were nonfiction. Biographies, war history, psychology. He studied people even behind walls. Once, during a random search, they found a list hidden behind a vent in his cell. Just names, dozens. Some were crossed out, some weren't. No context, no dates. But guards who saw it say they recognized at least 5 witnesses in federal custody, and 3 former Lucchese guys who'd flipped. When asked, Casso just smiled and said, "Just writing my memoir. Never know who's going to read it after I'm gone." And then, for years, silence. His name faded from news. Trials went on without him. New players emerged. Old ones died in halfway houses, or overdosed, or disappeared into the wind. But every so often, someone would ask, "You think Gaspipe really left a list? You think he ever told anyone the whole story?" Because here's the truth no one says out loud. Anthony Casso didn't die when he died. He died when he was forgotten. And some men would rather burn everything than go out quietly. One guard, assigned to his tier in 2018, described walking past his cell at night and hearing the man whisper, over and over, low, raspy, like a record stuck in a groove. 36, maybe 38, depends how you count them. He was talking about murders, his murders, and he couldn't quite remember the exact number, but he remembered enough to say it out loud, not bragging, just remembering. Like someone recalling old baseball scores. Like a man sorting through his legacy in the dark. He once told an inmate who asked about remorse, "I don't regret the kills. I regret the ones I let live." The walls inside ADX Florence weren't just concrete. They were deliberate, designed to deaden noise, to erase time, to remind men who they were when no one was watching. Casso had been in prisons before, Rikers, MCC New York, a few federal transit centers. Those places still hummed with life. Bad life, violent life, but life all the same. You could hear laughter, cards shuffling, radios playing Spanish pop. ADX wasn't like that. ADX was a whisper factory, a place where the loudest sound was your own thoughts bouncing off the walls. He had been there for years now, more than a decade. Cell 5 range, concrete bed, stainless steel toilet. 4 inches of glass between him and the outside world. 2 hours of recreation a day, in a cage, alone. He moved less, spoke less, didn't write letters anymore. And still, he thought, because a mind like Casso's didn't turn off. It rusted slowly. It sat like a loaded weapon on a shelf no one dared touch. Some nights, he paced, counted the steps, 6 steps to the wall, turn, 6 back. He used to keep count of everything, murders, jobs, who owed what. But in here, numbers didn't mean much. Time stretched and folded like wet paper. He didn't read fiction, said it insulted his intelligence. He stuck to biographies, history books, war memoirs. He admired leaders, but not the obvious ones, not Roosevelt or Eisenhower. He read about Stalin, about Genghis Khan, about men who ruled by fear. Respect is temporary, he once muttered during a psych eval. Fear's got legs. The psychiatrist said he was lucid but emotionally absent, said he was managing long-term isolation with pathological rigidity. That was a fancy way of saying, he's dead inside, but organized. And that was accurate. Casso still brushed his teeth at the same time every morning, still folded his clothes even though no one would see them, still tapped the same rhythm on the cell wall before lying down. Some ritual he never explained. Maybe a name, maybe a memory, maybe just the ghost of a pattern he used to control a world now far behind him. Once in a while, a new guard would get curious, ask him about the past, about the murders, the power, the betrayal. He'd shrug. All of that was someone else. I'm nobody now. But he didn't mean it. Not really. Because in his head, he was still gas pipe, still the man who could walk into a room and make men lower their eyes, still the man who ordered deaths the way most men ordered lunch, still the man who turned lawmen into hitmen and then made them vanish when they outlived their use. If his name didn't hold weight anymore, then nothing did. And that was the real sentence. Not the walls, not the cell, not even the dying. It was the fading. He wasn't afraid of death. Never had been. But being forgotten, that haunted him. He used to believe fear kept a man alive forever. That if enough people whispered your name, if enough ghosts carried it like a scar, you could live beyond your body. But the world was changing. The Mafia wasn't what it used to be. Younger guys were selling pills, hacking bank accounts, wearing hoodies instead of suits. They didn't respect the code. They didn't memorize the 5 families. Some of them couldn't even spell Omerta, let alone live by it. And they didn't know his name. That's what cut deepest. In 2017, a guard handed him a newspaper, a story about a new generation of gangsters in Brooklyn. Not one mention of Lucchese, not one quote about fear, just kids with gold teeth and Instagram accounts. He crumpled the paper without reading it all, said, "This ain't the game I bled for." And he had bled. Once, in the early days, a hit went bad. A guy pulled a blade on him outside a butcher shop, cut him across the arm, deep. Gas pipe beat him with a crowbar, then wrapped his own arm in a plastic bag and drove home like nothing happened. Didn't go to the hospital, didn't even flinch. Pain didn't bother him. But time was a different animal. It chipped away at him in quiet ways. His hands started trembling more. His walk slowed. The strength that once made him dangerous now made him tired. Getting out of bed felt like lifting wet cement. He refused a wheelchair. Refused help. Told one nurse, "If I can't walk, I don't deserve to stand." But that pride, it was all he had left. No visitors, no letters, no family. Even his own blood had stopped calling. Too scared, too ashamed, or maybe they just didn't want to be near the end of the story. Because that's what this was, the end. He knew it. In 2020, the virus started sweeping through the prison system. Guards wore masks, inmates were moved around, isolated, shuffled like cards in a bad hand. Casso heard the rumors, knew the risks. He was diabetic, had heart issues, had bad lungs from years of prison air and stress. The guard said he started coughing in November, refused treatment, told them to get lost. But when his fever hit 102, they forced him to medical. He spat blood, fought the nurses, screamed at them in Sicilian. They strapped him down. He lasted weeks longer than expected. His lungs filled slowly, his heartbeat dropped. And on December 15, 2020, just past midnight, Anthony Gaspipe Casso died in federal custody. No priest, no prayers, no last rites, just a nurse in full PPE, a dim light, and the soft beeping of a monitor that stopped with a dull final note. And that was it. No one claimed the body right away. The Bureau cremated him, ashes, no marker, no family dispute, no drama, just silence. But legends don't vanish like that. A week later, in Brooklyn, a man walked into a barbershop in Gravesend. Old joint. Been there since the 60s. He asked the barber, "You ever hear of Gaspipe?" The barber paused, looked over his shoulder. Not anymore, and went back to cutting. Because that's how the story ends for men like Casso. Not with a bang, but with a name that no one wants to say too loud. Because even dead, some ghosts bite back. And even in ashes, some names carry weight. Gaspipes was one of them. You just had to be old enough to remember, or foolish enough to forget. The prison cremated Anthony Casso quickly, quietly, and without ceremony. Just a name on a report, a tray, a flame, a code number, and then a handful of ashes that no one asked for. Not his wife, not his kids, not his crew, what was left of it. It should have been the final curtain, but stories like his don't stay buried in bureaucratic paperwork. They linger. Especially when the people left behind are still breathing, still remembering, still afraid of what Gaspipe didn't take with him. In Brooklyn, the air changed after Casso died. Not cleaner, not lighter, just different. Like a threat had gone quiet, but hadn't really disappeared. The older guys, the ones who used to walk into social clubs with their heads high and leave with blood on their cuffs, they didn't celebrate. They didn't drink to his death or spit on his name. They just went quiet. Because there were still questions about what he left behind, about who he talked to, about what secrets might still be out there, waiting. There were whispers that Casso had kept a ledger, not just the notebook the feds found when he flipped, a different one, the real one, the one with names, money, payoffs, maybe even notes on the hits he never ordered but knew about, the ones he used as leverage, insurance, blackmail. And in this world, nothing is more dangerous than a dead man's secrets that haven't surfaced yet. Because secrets don't disappear, they drip. In early 2021, just a few months after his death, someone broke into an old warehouse in Staten Island. The place had been shuttered since the late 90s, dust on the floor, cobwebs in the rafters, nothing valuable, nothing obvious. But whoever broke in didn't want money. They wanted a specific unit, a second-floor storage room behind a false wall, sealed with a steel door, tucked behind discarded kitchen equipment and a stack of rusted gym lockers. No one had touched it in over 20 years. Until someone did. The lock was cut. The door opened. Inside were 3 crates, unmarked. Heavy, bolted shut. By the time the police were called, because an off-duty officer lived 2 blocks down and saw something suspicious, the crates were gone. No fingerprints, no surveillance, just empty air and the soft weight of an unanswered question. Someone had been looking for something Casso might have left behind. Down in Florida, a retired Lucchese associate named Richie Slats Monaro heard about the break-in the next day. He was living in a senior complex just north of Fort Lauderdale. Clean record. Lived off a pension and hush money. Told the neighbors he used to work in shipping. Played shuffleboard 3 times a week. But that night, after he got the call, he didn't sleep. He sat in a recliner, lights off, the phone in his lap, just breathing, listening. He knew what those crates were, or at least what they might have been. Years ago, Casso had told him something strange, over drinks late at night when the club was quiet and the world felt untouchable. "If they ever take me off the street," he said, "I want you to remember 3 names. Hastings, Mulberry, Victory. Write 'em down." Slats had. And when he heard about the warehouse, the address on Victory Boulevard, he felt that old, cold knot in his gut twist like a corkscrew. He'd thought about those 3 names for years. Street names, storage units, buried money. He didn't ask. You didn't ask Casso twice. But now, with the boss cremated and gone, Slats was thinking again. Thinking too much. He called his nephew the next morning. a street-smart kid who used to move pills before turning legit, told him, "I need you to check something out in Staten Island." The nephew paused. "We don't touch that place, Uncle Rich. It's cursed." But Slats just said, "Curses are for people with clean hands. Mine ain't been clean since '81. Back in Brooklyn, the Lucchese remnants were getting twitchy. The crew that had taken over after Amuso's fall was fractured. The new boss, a quiet, calculating type named Frankie B., was trying to clean things up. Keep the feds off their back. Go back to union money, construction scams, credit card skims. No more high-profile hits. No more heat. But this break-in, it was heat. And more than that, it was fear. Because if someone was digging into Casso's past, then no one was safe. Frankie called a meeting at an old pizzeria in Sheepshead Bay. 10 guys showed up. Half of them looked over their shoulders more than they looked at him. He stood up and said what everyone was already thinking. "If Gaspipe left something behind, we need to find it first. If it's nothing, fine. But if it's names, we burn it. Fast." No one disagreed, not because they respected Frankie, because Casso still scared them, even dead, even cremated, even erased from the Bureau's files. His shadow still stretched across the table. One of the guys, a grizzled enforcer named Benny Rizzo, asked what everyone was afraid to say. "You think he planned this? Left it all to come out after he died?" Frankie didn't answer right away. Then he said, "If he did, we better hope he liked us more than he didn't." The silence that followed was thick enough to chew. The truth was, no one knew what Casso had really left behind. During his cooperation, he gave the feds some information. 36 murders, 2 dirty cops, dozens of names. But everyone in the life knew he didn't give them everything. He held back. That was Casso's style. Never play your full hand. Always keep a card up your sleeve, even when the house is burning. The FBI had always suspected it. His file was thick with redacted interviews, odd gaps, and references to unverified claims. And now, years later, the Bureau quietly reopened a few old boxes. Not an official investigation, just curiosity. 2 agents assigned to cold cases started connecting dots. Casso had mentioned a murder in passing, something that never made headlines. A man killed in 1984. No autopsy, no body, just a rumor. Now that same man's name showed up on a lease agreement tied to a Staten Island property, signed in 1992. A ghost renting real estate. Something didn't add up. And that's when they started wondering, what if Casso had built a second ledger? One not for leverage, not for the government, but for himself, as protection, as insurance, or as revenge. Maybe he knew he'd be betrayed. Maybe he knew the feds would use him and toss him. Maybe he wanted to make sure the story stayed alive, his way. In the months that followed, more whispers emerged. A construction foreman in Long Island said he remembered Casso showing up to a site in '89, pointing at a foundation pit and saying, "You see that? You pour concrete on secrets like that." A retired bookie claimed Casso used to talk about a library, not for books, but for sins. "You don't burn a library," he'd say. "You let it sit. You let it wait." And then there was the anonymous letter. It arrived at a Queens law office in May 2021, typed. No return address, postmarked from Colorado. Inside was a single sheet of paper, just 2 lines. "He lied to all of you. The truth's in the box. No signature, no context, no explanation." The attorney who received it? He'd represented one of the Lucchese families during a major case in 2005. He hadn't heard Gaspipe's name in over a decade. But when he read that note, he felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Because that's what Anthony Casso did best. He made people remember, not with stories, not with speeches, but with absence, with the knowledge that if he had something on you, it never went away. Not with time, not with distance, not even with death. And now, someone was opening the past like a locked drawer, and the streets were holding their breath again. There's a certain kind of fear that doesn't show itself in screams. It doesn't come with sirens or sudden gunfire. It arrives in silence, in the unread message, the missed call. The face you thought you'd never see again. In the months after Anthony Casso died, that fear crept slowly back into the bones of men who had built entire lives around the idea that he was gone, not just physically, but spiritually. Like the shadow he cast had finally dissolved in the prison dust of ADX Florence. But they were wrong, because something was surfacing. Not a man, not a ghost, a plan. The crates from the Staten Island warehouse had never been found. The FBI wouldn't confirm they ever existed. NYPD shrugged it off as rumor. But word on the street, and in certain government corridors, was that 3 names had been scratched into the side of one of those crates. Ippolito, Caracappa, D'Angelo. 2 were already dead. The 3rd was still alive and hiding. Danny D'Angelo wasn't famous, not a capo, not a killer, not even a made guy. He was what they called useful background, a guy who moved information, handled keys, ran messages across boroughs, smart enough to stay out of prison, quiet enough to be forgotten. But he hadn't been forgotten, not by Casso, and apparently not by whoever had found the crates, because 2 weeks after the break-in, Danny vanished. He'd been living under a different name, managing a car wash in New Jersey. Left work one night, never made it home. No signs of a struggle, no car, no phone, just gone. The same way men used to disappear when Gaspipe ran the streets. And suddenly, the whispers weren't just whispers anymore. In the Bronx, Frankie B sat in the back of an old butcher shop that doubled as an unofficial Lucchese clubhouse. Not many guys came around anymore. The heat was too much, the loyalty too thin. But he still held court, not out of ego, but out of necessity. He'd been a kid when Casso ruled, watched from a distance, kept his mouth shut, made his bones the quiet way. Now, he was in charge, technically, but he felt more like a lighthouse keeper, watching the tide come in, wondering if the whole thing would finally collapse beneath him. That night, he had 3 men sitting across from him, one old, one middle-aged, one young, a strange reflection of the generations left in the game. He poured them whiskey. No one touched it. Instead, he reached into a drawer and placed a photograph on the table. Black and white. Faded. 4 men standing beside a dumpster in Brooklyn, late 1980s. Casso in the middle, smiling, holding a cigarette. The other 3? Dead, officially. But now, one of them had been spotted, where someone who looked like him, up in Buffalo, wearing the same scar above the lip, working under a new name. "You think Gaspipe faked the kills?" the youngest man asked, voice shaking slightly. Frankie shook his head. "No, but I think he documented them, and I think whoever has that documentation is using it now." The older man leaned forward. "For what? Blackmail?" "No," Frankie said quietly. "For leverage. To remind the rest of us who really ran this city and what happens when we forget." Meanwhile, down in Florida, Richie Slats Monaro was still chasing ghosts. His nephew had come back from Staten Island empty-handed. No crates, no names. Just a boarded-up building and a few angry cops who didn't want outsiders poking around. But Slats wasn't letting it go, because back in '91, he'd seen Casso hand off something heavy in a duffel bag. Not to a soldier, not to a capo, to a woman. Short, olive skin, sharp eyes. Wore boots in summer. Slats had always thought she was a girlfriend, maybe a cousin. But when he asked Anthony later, the reply was flat. "She keeps the things I don't want men touching." Slats hadn't thought about her in years, but now she was the only lead. He started making calls, old numbers, bars that were gone, landlines disconnected, and finally, through a guy who ran a pawn shop in Coney Island, he got a name. Angela Marcetti. No priors, no record, no footprint, but she existed, and she was living in Maine. In Brooklyn, one more domino fell. Another old associate, Vinny Tommaso, was found dead in his apartment. Heart attack, they said. But the timing was off. He'd called his cousin 2 days before, panicking. Said someone had mailed him a photo from 1986. A picture of him standing outside a nightclub with Gaspipe. On the back, written in red ink, "I never forget who stood beside me." The cousin showed the cops. They shrugged, said it was probably a sick prank, but the cousin knew better. Because Vinny had testified in 2001, quietly, under seal. Nobody knew. Nobody but the feds, and apparently someone else. Frankie B called an emergency sit-down. 12 men, quiet location, no phones, just the smell of old wood and tension. He stood at the head of the table and said it outright. We got a problem. Not with cops, not with Albanians, not even with the Russians. We got a dead man's shadow walking around. Some scoffed, said it was drama, said it was paranoia, but then Frankie opened a manila envelope and slid it across the table. Inside, a page of names, 7, all familiar, all alive. All had testified or cooperated at some point. All had recently received handwritten letters, unsigned, same writing, same ink, same phrasing. The fire you fed still burns. And one of the names belonged to a judge, a sitting federal judge in Manhattan. Now the table went quiet, because this wasn't just about revenge anymore. This was about design. Someone, maybe something Casso built, was still active, still pulling strings, still sending messages. And no one knew where the next one would land. Meanwhile, in Maine, Richie Slat's Monaro finally knocked on the right door. Small cottage, forest behind it, no neighbors close by. Mailbox rusted, no name on it. The woman who answered looked older now, weathered, but the eyes, still sharp, still watching. Angela, he asked. She didn't answer, just stared, then stepped aside. He walked in. The house was clean, too clean, like no one really lived there. Books stacked on the table, war memoirs, files, newspaper clippings about the 5 families. She pointed to a chair. He sat, said nothing. Finally, she broke the silence. He told me you'd come eventually. Richie's breath caught. When? Didn't say. Just said when they start forgetting who he was, someone would come looking for the truth. So is this it? Richie asked. The truth? Angela turned and opened a drawer, pulled out a small black box, laid it gently on the table. You tell me. He opened it. Inside, cassette tapes, 4 of them, labeled, dated, in a single envelope. On it, in that unmistakable handwriting, play only if you're ready to carry what I carried. Slats closed the box slowly. His hands were shaking, because whether it was a trap, a warning, or a final confession, one thing was certain. Gaspipe's story wasn't over. Not yet. Richie Slat's Monaro drove back to New York in silence. The box of tapes sat on the passenger seat like a coffin. He didn't touch it again, didn't peek inside, didn't even stop for gas. Just drove, chain-smoking menthols with the windows cracked, headlights dragging long shadows behind him on I-95. The cold New England night pressing down like unfinished business. He was 72 now, liver-spotted, knees aching. But inside, something young and sharp had woken up again. Something he hadn't felt since the Reagan years. Fear. Not the kind that made you run, the kind that made you think. Casso was gone, buried, burned, scattered, but somehow the man had left himself behind, and Richie didn't know whether he was holding a confession or a loaded gun. He reached Brooklyn just before sunrise, pulled into a quiet lot behind an old bakery that hadn't sold bread in 15 years. The owner was a friend, no cameras, no questions. Inside the back room, Richie locked the door, sat at the dusty table, and finally, opened the box again. He laid the 4 tapes out like tarot cards. Each one was labeled in neat block handwriting, all in the same fine point black ink Casso always used. Tape 1, Vario to Vic. Tape 2, Crystal Balls, The Cops. Tape 3, The Split. Tape 4, Final Orders. He stared at them, trying to feel the weight of history in plastic shells, tried to picture Gaspipe himself, hunched over in a basement somewhere in the 90s, recording these in secret while smiling to himself, knowing one day they'd outlive him. But the real question wasn't why he recorded them. It was what he wanted to happen after. Richie picked up tape 1. The name said it all. Vario to Vic. Paulie Vario, the old boss. Vic Amuso, the newer one. And in between them, Gaspipe. The man who never liked being in second place, even if he said he didn't care. He found an old cassette deck in the bakery's closet, dusted it off, and pressed play. The tape clicked, then silence, then his voice. If you're listening to this, then I'm either dead or close, doesn't matter which. Either way, I win. Casso sounded calm, not old, not tired, just in control. They think this thing ends when they stick you in a box, but that's not how legacy works. You want to know how it works? Keep listening. There was a pause. Then came the names. Paulie gave me my start, showed me the ropes. I watched him clip guys over money, over disrespect. But you know what he never did? He never cleaned house. That's where I came in. Richie sat up straighter. The tape continued. Paulie knew Vic wasn't built for leadership. He was all fire, no spine. Thought if he shouted loud enough, the walls would obey. But I saw it right away. Vic wanted control, but he didn't want responsibility. So I gave him both, and I gave him me. You want to know how I got from soldier to underboss? Paulie asked me to spy on Vic. Vic asked me to spy on Paulie. I did both. Fed them what they wanted, kept what I needed. I made myself indispensable. And then, when Paulie died, another pause. I became something else. Not boss, not underboss. Something higher, something quieter. Click. The tape ended. Richie sat there still holding his breath. He hadn't heard Casso's voice in nearly 30 years, and yet it felt like the man was still standing in the room, just off to the side, smiling that thin smile, waiting for the listener to realize something. He put in tape 2 next, the one labeled Crystal Balls, the Cops, the one that could still bring down the walls of half of Manhattan's old police hierarchy. The tape hissed. Then, people think I found Caracappa and Ippolito by accident. I didn't. They came to me, through a guy named Jimmy H. Richie blinked. That name was never in any court files. Jimmy H. worked Midtown Vice, had a gambling problem. His brother owed me. So I leaned in. Jimmy introduced me to Lou. Lou brought in Steve. 2 cops, real ones, shielded, decorated, loyal, not to the badge, to me. They did more than kill for me. They watched my enemies, pulled surveillance logs, fed me FBI files, told me who flipped before the rats even knew they'd flipped. You think the feds ever really caught me? Please. They let me walk for years because I was using their own shadows against them. Click. Another end. Richie felt his heart ticking faster now. Casso wasn't just talking history. He was setting up a framework, like he was guiding someone. But guiding them to what? He picked up tape 3, the split. This one felt heavier, somehow darker. He played it. Everything fell apart in Scranton. Vic got spooked, thought I was getting too much attention, too much fear. So he ran. But he didn't run from the cops, he ran from me. Started spreading rumors that I flipped early, that I was greedy, that I had eyes on the top chair. He was right. So I did what I had to, took the reins, quietly, sent messages, reorganized the family from inside. But Vic wasn't done. He left a trail, planted people, fed just enough to the feds to keep me in their sights. Thought he was slick. So I burned everything. Another pause, then softer. I trusted no one after that. Click. The machine hummed. Richie took a deep breath. The truth had always been messy. But this wasn't just messy. This was a confession hidden in instructions, a slow breadcrumb trail of destruction. He looked at the final tape. Tape 4. Final orders. He didn't play it. Not yet. Something told him this wasn't meant for just anyone, that this tape wasn't about the past, it was about what came next. Richie put the tapes back in the box, locked it, and slid it under the floorboard behind the boiler, a trick he'd learned from Casso himself. Then he left the bakery and walked 2 blocks to an old payphone, still bolted into the side of a shuttered Chinese restaurant. He dialed a number he hadn't called in 20 years. It rang 5 times. A voice answered, gravelly, dry. Yeah. He left instructions, Richie said quietly. On tape, 4 of them, maybe more out there. Silence. Then, I'm listening. The voice on the other end of the line didn't ask for details. He just gave a name, an address in Ozone Park, and a time. Richie Monaro hung up without a word. That was the rule. Always say less when the dead start talking. By now, his body was stiff from the drive, his back a mess of knots, and his fingers trembled. But not from age, from instinct. That sharp, acidic buzz in his gut was back. The same one he'd felt in 1986, when a job went sideways and he had to bury two brothers in the dark with a borrowed shovel. The same one he felt in 91, the night Casso told him, "Everything I build for after I'm gone." Back then, Richie hadn't understood. Thought it was just ego talking. But now, with 4 tapes locked beneath a boiler and a phone call answered by a voice he thought was long retired, Richie knew. Casso hadn't left behind a legacy. He'd left instructions. He arrived at the Ozone Park address just past 3 p.m. It was a pawn shop. Glass front, security gate rolled halfway up. Inside, cheap watches and used electronics sat in dusty cases. A "We Buy Gold" sign blinked red in the window, flickering like a dying signal. The bell rang as Richie entered. No customers, no music. Just that soft hum of neon and a fan spinning above a stained ceiling. Behind the counter stood a man in his late 60s. Long face, tired eyes, thin hands that looked like they used to be quick. Richie knew him instantly. Gio Needles Trivedi. Back in the 80s, Gio was Casso's problem solver. Never made man, but close. Too twitchy, too unpredictable. Smart, though. Brilliant, even. The kind of guy who could dismantle a surveillance van blindfolded. He fixed bugs, wired houses, tapped phones, and disappeared right before Casso flipped in 94. Everyone thought Gio died in Florida. Clearly not. "Slats," Gio said, stepping out from behind the counter. "Took you long enough. Didn't know if it was really you." Nobody ever does. They didn't shake hands. Old school guys didn't always need to. Sometimes all it took was a look, a nod that said we're still alive, and that means something. Richie followed Gio into the back room. It was cluttered, but beneath the junk there was order. A fold-out table, a filing cabinet with broken drawers, a corkboard full of maps, notes, crime scene photos, printouts from old DOJ archives. Half were yellowed from age, the others were recent. "You got the tapes?" Gio asked. "4 of them. "Final orders?" Richie hesitated. "Didn't play it." Gio smiled, bitter. "Smart. That one's not for civilians." "You think we're civilians? Compared to what's coming?" "Yeah." He walked over to the table and pulled out a folder. Inside were photocopies of sealed court documents, FBI memos, snippets of Casso's testimony that never made it into court. Richie flipped through them. One stood out, a handwritten note in the margins of a redacted 302 form. "Those I name are dead, but those I don't, they'll wish they were." Richie looked up. "You think he left more than just these tapes?" "I know he did," Gio said. "He called it the orchard." "The what?" "His insurance. You plant the trees while you're alive, slats, but the fruit grows after you die." He pulled out a sketch. A simple layout, rows and boxes and letters. It looked like nothing, but to Richie, it looked like a burial map. "What is this?" "Names," Gio said. "Addresses, dead drops, storage, maybe even bodies. Every square has a story. And all of them trace back to people who thought gas pipe forgot them." "How do you know?" Gio handed over a single photograph, black and white, taken sometime in the late 80s. Anthony Casso standing in front of a small orchard, leafless trees, dirt path, a barn in the back. Casso was holding a shovel. "He made me take that photo," Gio said. "Told me one day I'd need to prove he was always 10 steps ahead." "Where is it?" "Upstate, near Liberty. Abandoned now, but not empty." By nightfall, they were driving north. Richie behind the wheel, Gio riding shotgun, the box of tapes between them. No music, no words for the first hour. Only the rhythm of tires against old asphalt and the sound of 2 men remembering everything they tried to forget. "You think this is revenge?" Richie finally asked. "From the grave?" Gio shook his head. "It's not about revenge. It's about control. He didn't trust the system, the feds, or even us, so he made a system of his own. This orchard? It's not just where he buried secrets. It's where he built the future." "Whose future?" "That's what scares me." They reached the property just after midnight. It looked like any other forgotten patch of land off Route 17. Chain link fence rusted through in places, a sagging gate, no lights, no motion, just trees, dead ones, barren, pale bark, black branches that reached up like cracked hands. They walked in slowly. Gio had the sketch. He paced it out. 15 steps from the gate, 10 east, 5 south. And then he stopped. Here. He knelt down and began to dig with a crowbar. Richie watched the tree line, eyes scanning for movement. His heart beat like it hadn't in decades. After 10 minutes of scraping, Gio struck something solid. A metal box. They hauled it out, wiped it clean. Casso's initials were etched into the top. Inside, stacks of envelopes, keys, floppy disks, a burner phone wrapped in foil, and another tape, unlabeled. Just a piece of paper inside the lid that read, "Play this only when you're ready to take my seat." Richie's blood went cold. "You think he built a succession plan?" "No," Gio said. "Then what?" Gio looked at the orchard around them. "I think he built a trigger." They didn't speak on the drive back. Gio held the new metal box in his lap like it was radioactive. He didn't open it again. Richie didn't ask him to. The burner phone inside was still wrapped in foil. Old school trick. Casso knew the future would try to listen. He'd taken every precaution like a man preparing not for war, but for the decades after the war ended. Back at Gio's pawn shop, they bolted the doors, killed the lights, and took the box into the back room. Then they sat down. Just two old men in a room full of ghosts. The orchard had been real. The storage box had been real. The unlabeled tape sitting now on the table between them was terrifyingly real. Richie looked at Gio. "You think he knew we'd be the ones to find it?" Gio snorted. "He didn't think. He planned." They let the question hang. If this tape was what they feared, not a message, not a confession, but an activation, then playing it could be the equivalent of pulling a pin on something they couldn't put back. Still, they didn't come this far to stare at plastic. Gio slid the tape into the old cassette deck and pressed play. It clicked once, then hissed, then came his voice. Calm. Crisp, alive. "If you're hearing this, then one of three things happened. 1, I died like a man. 2, I was erased by cowards. 3, I chose silence." Pause. "But no matter what they tell you, I'm still here." The tape was clearer than the others, almost like it had been recorded in a studio. No background noise, no coughs, no hesitation, just intention. "This life we built, it doesn't belong to the 5 families anymore. Well, it belongs to whoever has the information, the fear, the leverage. The orchard was just a seed. The roots go farther." Richie glanced at Gio, who had gone still, eyes locked on the recorder like it might bite. Casso's voice continued. "Inside this box, you'll find names, real names. Some are dead. Some are just sleeping under new ones. All of them owe me. There's also a list. You'll know it when you see it. It's coded. You'll need the key. If you're worthy of hearing this, you already have it, somewhere. These people will lie. They'll swear they left the life, that they're just businessmen now. Some wear robes, some wear badges, one even got elected. But they all came from the same dirt I did." Another pause, longer this time. "I'm not asking you to finish anything. I already finished most of it. I'm asking you to remind them. Remind the world that silence has a price, and I already paid the deposit." Click, the tape ended, but the room didn't move. Gio exhaled for the first time in minutes. "Jesus Christ." "No," Richie said, staring at the box. "Not Jesus. Something older." They opened the rest of the box. Inside, a handwritten ledger. Yellowing pages, neat ink, dates, times, code names. Some entries were blacked out. Others were underlined. One page was marked only with the letter K at the top, circled twice. Next to it, a phone number, a safe deposit box number, and a location. Albany. "What's in Albany?" Richie asked. Gio shook his head slowly. "Whatever it is, it's still active." The next day, the two men took separate trains north. They didn't speak again, didn't use phones, didn't carry IDs. Old habits, Albany was cold, gray, and forgettable. Exactly the kind of place Casso would have picked. Too political to raise suspicion, too boring to watch closely. Richie followed the clues first. The phone number on the ledger? Disconnected, but not deleted. A ghost number. The kind that only rang if someone knew the exact code to trigger it. The safe deposit box was harder. It took Gio 2 hours to find the bank that still held the box number. It was under the name Anthony Costa, one of Casso's known aliases from the 80s. He approached the front desk with a forged letter and fake ID, both drawn from templates Casso had designed long ago, anticipating every possible loophole. The clerk hesitated, looked him up and down. Gio smiled, that tight, crooked smile that said, "I dare you to ask questions." 15 minutes later, they were in the vault. The deposit box was heavier than it should have been. Inside, another envelope. No tape this time, no ledger, just a USB stick, a stack of aged photographs, and a newspaper clipping from April 1984, the day a construction foreman named Sal Polizzi went missing from a site in Queens. Sal had never been found. He was last seen walking into a meeting with Anthony Casso and 2 men from the City Planning Commission. That story never made headlines, but the clipping had red ink across the top. Sal knew too much. The photos were of men, all middle-aged now or older, at restaurants, at weddings, at retirement parties, smiling, fat, gray-haired, living normal lives. Some wore lapel pins. One had a judge's robe. They were former criminals. But not just any. Ghosts from Casso's past. Guys who flipped, vanished, or were presumed dead. But here they were, living under new names. And somehow, Casso had kept track, had surveillance, long after he was locked away. Gio flipped through the photos, breath shallow. He didn't just make a list, he whispered. He made a network, an afterlife. Richie nodded slowly. He waited for them to get comfortable, then made sure someone would come for them. Us. No, Richie said. He looked at the USB stick. Not us. Whoever comes after us. They spent that night in separate motels. Didn't speak. Didn't sleep much. The USB stick was encrypted. Gio knew how to crack it, but he also knew what might happen if they did. Whatever was on it wasn't meant for light consumption. They agreed to meet again in 48 hours. But Richie never showed. Gio waited in the back of the pawn shop with the curtains drawn and the door locked. Called the old number 3 times. No answer. He drove to Richie's apartment. Nothing. Checked hospitals, morgues, nothing. Richie. Slat's Monaro was gone. No signs of a struggle. No broken lock. No blood. Just gone. Gio stood in the middle of the apartment, staring at the dark television screen, and finally understood. Casso hadn't just left tools. He had left traps. Traps for everyone, even the loyal, especially the loyal. 2 days later, a package arrived at Gio's shop. No return address. Inside, a burner phone and a single photo. It was Richie, dead, eyes open, mouth duct-taped. On the back of the photo, written in red ink, "Silence is a legacy too." Gio sat down, not because he was shocked, because he knew it wasn't the end. The USB still sat in a safe under the floorboards, untouched. But now, he understood. This wasn't a legacy. It was a relay race. And Richie had dropped the baton, which meant it was now in Gio's hands. Gio stared at the photograph for a long time. Richie's eyes were wide open in death, not shocked, not terrified, just accepting. That's what chilled Gio most. He knew Richie well. They came from the same streets, grew under the same fists, survived the same wars. Richie was cautious, paranoid, methodical. But he wasn't afraid of dying, only afraid of dying too late. And this? This looked like a message from someone who still played by Gaspipe's rules. No signature, no explanation, just a picture and one sentence scrawled in red ink. Silence is a legacy too. Gio put the photo down carefully. Then he locked the shop doors, pulled the blinds, and turned off every light. If this was the beginning of something, and it was, he didn't need attention. He needed answers. The USB was still hidden beneath the floorboards, wrapped in cloth, shielded in foil, exactly how Casso would have wanted it. Gio unwrapped it slowly, plugged it into an old offline laptop he kept for sensitive work. No Wi-Fi, no Bluetooth, just a blank machine that could read but not talk. It opened a single folder, Orchard Keyed X. No passwords, no prompts, just one click. Gio hesitated, not out of fear, but out of understanding. He knew Casso, knew his style. The man didn't believe in accidents. If this file existed, it was meant to hurt someone. He clicked. A black screen opened, then a voice. Not gas pipes, but digitized, distorted, like it had been filtered through a machine. Welcome to the Orchard. A loading bar crawled across the screen, then the first file appeared. Contingency A. Gio opened it. A list of names, faces, addresses, some marked confirmed, some marked pending. Every name on the list was someone connected to the Lucchese family, past and present, not just mobsters, lawyers, judges, city inspectors, low-level clerks, even a former priest. There were notes on who had flipped, who had lied in testimony, who had taken deals quietly. Each name was followed by 3 columns: what they did, where they are now, what leverage remains. One entry caught Gio's eye. Name: Thomas Rizzo. Former role: NYPD detective involvement, delivered surveillance tapes to Amuzo Casso crew 1988-1990. Current role: private security, Yonkers leverage, video of payoff, VHS archived at Site 2B. Site 2B. Gio opened a second file titled Map Matrix, a grid, dozens of pins, locations marked with site numbers. Some were in New York, others stretched as far as Nevada, Canada, even Italy. Site 2B, a storage unit in Red Hook. He closed the laptop. Gio realized, slowly, that this wasn't a confession. It wasn't even revenge. It was a survival engine. Casso had built a system meant to outlive him, not to keep his name alive, but to keep everyone else's in check. Every person who'd ever helped him. Every person who'd betrayed him. He'd filed them, tagged them, leveraged them. If they stayed quiet, the files stayed buried. If they talked, the orchard bloomed. And Richie's death. That wasn't a warning. That was the first bloom. Gio didn't go to Red Hook immediately. He made 2 stops first. One, to a tailor in Bay Ridge, an old associate who still owed him from the late 90s. The second, to a storage locker of his own, filled with equipment, old burner phones, paper maps, gloves, tools, surveillance gear. He packed it all into a gym bag, then drove to Red Hook with his lights off most of the way. The storage unit was in a rundown industrial lot surrounded by forgotten warehouses and overgrown fences. It didn't look like much, but Casso had always picked boring places to hide dangerous things. Gio found Unit 2B, unlocked it. Inside, an old file cabinet, a cooler, and 3 boxes labeled in faded marker. He opened the top box, photographs, stacks of them, labeled, dated, surveillance angles, candid shots, license plates. He flipped through them, recognizing faces long believed to be clean. A former Lucchese capo's daughter, a retired prosecutor, a construction union boss who claimed to have never met Casso. Lies, all of them, caught in grainy black and white. In the second box, VHS tapes, some labeled, others not. He found one with the label Rizzo Payoff, 1989, parking lot. He didn't need to watch it. He knew what it meant. That former cop, now running a security firm in Yonkers, had lied under oath during Casso's trials, claimed he'd never taken bribes, that he'd never seen Anthony Casso in person. This tape proved otherwise. Gio realized something else. Every tape here was a bullet, a digital revolver with the safety off. By the time Gio got back to the shop, the sun was rising. He was exhausted, but not sleepy. Casso hadn't just collected blackmail. He'd built a pressure system. If one person flipped, the system responded. If one of his people was killed, the system responded. If he died, the system responded. And Richie had triggered it. Gio opened the laptop again. The Orchard interface blinked silently, awaiting the next click. There was one folder he hadn't opened yet. Final sequence. He hovered over it, finger trembling slightly. He clicked. Inside, a single PDF document, 2 pages. The first page was a list of 12 names. No details, no roles, just names. 8 of them had already been crossed out in red. The 9th, Richie Monaro. The 10th, Giovanni Trevetti, his own name, written cleanly, uncrossed. The second page had only 1 sentence, typed, black ink. If they hear this, it's too late to save them. Gio closed the laptop, slowly, calmly. Then reached under the desk and pulled out the small revolver he'd kept there since the day he opened the pawn shop. Loaded, old, but still reliable. He placed it on the desk. Then, for the first time in decades, he turned on the shop's security camera, the one he'd installed years ago but never used. He sat back in the chair, looked straight into the lens, and spoke. If you're seeing this, you found the tapes. That means you opened the box. That means you're next. He took a breath. There's no walking away from this, not anymore. Casso made sure of that. The orchard doesn't forgive, it just remembers. Another pause. He built it to keep us in line, but it's loose now, and it doesn't care who planted it, only who's left. He reached for the gun, not to use it, just to feel it. I don't know what happens next, but I know one thing. Gaspipe wasn't trying to live forever. He was trying to make sure no one else could. He stood up, turned the camera off, and packed a bag. There was still 1 name left uncrossed after his. He didn't recognize it, but he was going to find out who it belonged to. Because if the orchard was blooming now, someone had to burn it down. The last name on the list was clean. Too clean. Elias Ventura. Gio stared at it for 20 minutes straight, trying to find a trace, a whisper, a memory. But the name meant nothing. It wasn't Italian, it wasn't old school. It didn't belong in any of the usual circles. And that, Gio realized, was exactly why it was dangerous. Casso didn't add names lightly. If this one was the final entry in the final sequence, it meant Ventura either meant everything, or he was the trigger to end it all. Gio didn't know which yet, but he was going to find out. He left the pawn shop before sunrise, taking only the USB, the final tape, and a burner phone that had been charged but never turned on. He didn't leave a note, didn't lock up, didn't even turn the closed sign around. He'd known for days now that he wouldn't be coming back. The orchard was too big, too old, too buried in the bones of people who had convinced themselves they were safe. And Gio. He was the last person left who remembered what it felt like to look Anthony Casso in the eyes and not lie. He started in Queens, quietly. A few favors. A few calls to old bookmakers who still kept mental Rolodexes of everyone who passed through New York under an alias. Nothing came up under Elias Ventura. Then he checked prison records, both federal and state, going back 40 years. Still nothing. That ruled out snitches. Ventura hadn't flipped, hadn't testified, hadn't been arrested. So who the hell was he? It wasn't until Gio took a train down to D.C., paid a quiet visit to a disgraced former FBI agent who now ran a PI firm out of a rented office, that he got a hit. The man pulled out an old digital database and ran the name, then stopped typing. That name's red flagged. Red flagged how? As in, not supposed to exist. It's tied to a sealed government identity transfer. Mid-90s. Gio's eyes narrowed. Witness protection. Worse. The agent leaned in, lowering his voice. You ever heard of the Continuity Clearance Program? Gio shook his head. It's a shadow version of WITSEC, the agent said. Not for guys who testify, and for guys who are too dangerous to let disappear. The government relocates them with new names, but keeps a leash on them. What kind of guys? Ghosts, hitmen, asset handlers, deep black operatives, and sometimes, he hesitated. Guys like Casso. Gio felt a chill snake down his spine. You're saying this Elias Ventura was one of ours? No, I'm saying he was one of his. The trail led north, not to a neighborhood or a safe house, but to a town. Saranac Lake, upstate, cold, quiet. The kind of place where men went to disappear, or wait. The files were thin, but the PI got Gio an address, a cabin just off the edge of a frozen lake. No neighbors, no mailbox, no paper trail since 1997. But the name on the deed? Elias Ventura. Gio drove there alone. No backup, no more favors, just him and a growing understanding that Casso hadn't died alone. He arrived near dusk. The sky was a dull blue bruise. Snow covered the road in patches, and the cabin was barely visible through the trees. Small, gray, quiet. Gio parked a quarter-mile down and approached on foot. Old habits, always circle, always listen. There were no lights on, no smoke from the chimney. But there was a generator running, quiet, deep in the woods. He circled the back, saw footprints in the snow, recent, deep. Whoever lived here wasn't old, wasn't frail, still active. Gio took out the burner and dialed the only number programmed into it. It rang once, then a voice. Not Elias Ventura, not gas pipe, a machine. You have arrived at the end of the sequence. What happens next is up to you. Click. No way to call back, no way to trace it. Gio stood there for a second, letting the weight of it all sink in. Then he moved. He stepped up to the cabin door and knocked. Once. Firm. Silence. Then a voice from inside. You're late. The man who opened the door was in his 50s, fit, clean-shaven, wearing a plain black sweater and jeans. He looked like a schoolteacher or a priest, not the last living remnant of Anthony Casso's empire. But Gio knew that look, the posture, the calm. Killer. He stepped inside without being asked. The cabin was spare, a table, 2 chairs, a fireplace with no fire, no photos, no clocks, just a laptop on the table, closed, and a burner phone beside it. You Ventura? Gio asked. Not anymore. Then who the hell are you? The man gestured to the seat. Gio didn't move. You're here because Richie played the last tape, the man said. That means it's time for this to end. End what? The orchard. All of it. Gio stared. I thought this was about Casso, about revenge. It was never about revenge, the man said. It was about design. You're telling me he built this whole thing? To die with him? To die after him, only when someone like you found the last name. Why me? Because you were loyal, not loud. You kept your head down, you never flipped. And Richie? The man nodded slowly. He never finished flipping. Silence fell between them. So what now? Gio finally asked. The man picked up the laptop and slid it across the table. Inside this is every file, every photo, every list, every audio tape, copies of the tapes you found, copies of things you never did. Enough to bring down what's left of New York's underworld and what's hiding behind it. And you expect me to do what with it? Burn it. Just like that? Casso trusted you, the man said, not to continue his legacy, but to end it right. Gio stared at the laptop. His reflection stared back. For 30 years, he'd lived in the margins, because men like Casso made the rules. And now, he was holding the button that could erase it all, not just the lies, but the truth beneath them. He reached for the laptop. What happens if I don't? The man looked at him, and for the first time, he smiled. Then the orchard grows again. The laptop was warm in Gio's hands, a strange detail. It meant the man, Elias Ventura, or whoever he truly was, had been using it, recently. Which meant this wasn't just a dead drop. This wasn't a box of memories, left to rot. It was still alive. Gio sat down at the table. The cabin was cold. Outside, the trees creaked softly in the wind, the way old things whisper when no one listens. The man stood by the door, silent, watchful. Gio opened the laptop. No password prompt. It booted instantly. A single folder sat in the middle of the desktop. Final seed. He double-clicked. Inside, dozens of subfolders. Photos, tapes, digital, transcripts, financials, cooperators, law enforcement, witness relocations, senators, journalists, and at the bottom, the tree. Gio opened that last one. Inside was a document, clean, structured, chillingly organized. The Orchard Legacy Contingency Protocol, author A. Casso, date updated 2006. It read like a manifesto. The streets don't die, they mutate. When men flip, the code bends. When lawyers talk, the truth rots. But information survives, and with enough of it, even a dead man can win. Gio scrolled further. There were specific names, targets, enemies, but there were also instructions. If X happens, release folder A. If Y happens, activate contact line 3. If Z happens, eliminate archive, a complex web of contingencies, each one tied to someone still alive. But he clicked on one name, a city councilman, now running for mayor. The file included a recorded call from 1993, transcripts of meetings with a known Lucchese bagman, and photos of cash exchanged in a parking lot. All untouched, never leaked, never used. Why? Because Casso hadn't needed to use them. He hadn't built this as a bomb. He'd built it as a lever. He kept all this, Gio said quietly, still staring at the screen. For leverage, for control. The man at the door nodded once. He believed that fear wasn't just about violence. It was about certainty. Certainty that if someone whispered your name, somewhere, in some drawer, he had a file ready to burn you. And now you want me to burn all this? Not want, the man said. Need. Gio turned in the chair. Why me? Why not you? The man didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, it was low, tired. Because I'm part of it. I helped build it. He stepped forward now, his face clearer in the dim light. Back in the day, I wasn't just a ghost. I was one of the gardeners. I collected names, paid people off, covered tracks. So kill it yourself. I can't. Why? Because if I do, the system assumes I've gone rogue, and it triggers the backup sequence. Gio's throat tightened. So this thing really is alive. Not alive, just watching, always watching. The man gestured to the laptop. The moment you opened that file, it logged your location, marked the chain. You're the last one in the line. You shut it down, or it opens completely. What happens if it opens? The man smiled, but it wasn't warm. Then the world sees the orchard. Everything, every name, every tape, every document, all of it, sent to law enforcement, media, foreign governments. You mean it all goes public? Not public? Weaponized? Gio felt his stomach twist, because now he understood what Casso had meant by winning after death. If everything in this laptop went live, judges would fall, politicians, agents, even foreign operatives who had bought into the same corruption. Casso hadn't just mapped the underworld. He had mapped the foundation of the people pretending to stand above it. Gio leaned back. His shoulders ached, his hands were stiff. How do I shut it down? The man opened a drawer and pulled out a small envelope. Inside, a flash drive. Plug this in. It holds the kill code. And that's it? No, that's just the first step. Once you plug it in, you'll have to decide if you want to wipe the orchard or seal it. What's the difference? If you wipe it, it's gone. Truly gone. Nothing left. If you seal it, it goes dormant. Locked, buried, the system stops, but doesn't forget. You want me to seal it? No, the man said, voice distant. I want to disappear. Gio understood. The man wasn't looking for salvation. He was looking for release. He was the final gatekeeper of a machine he no longer wanted to tend. And now, it was Gio's burden. One last choice. He took the flash drive, plugged it into the laptop. The screen changed instantly. 2 buttons, erase, orchard, seal, orchard. A timer appeared beneath them. 4:59. Gio stared. He thought about the names, the faces, the men who lived with lies in their pockets, the families they built on blood and silence. He thought about the judges, the cops, the informants who never paid. He thought about Richie, about the orchard Casso planted, a network of fear reaching beyond the grave. He could erase it all, or lock it away forever, or let it bloom. 04:12. He closed his eyes, thought about who he had been before the life, before the guns, before the tapes. Back when he was just a smart kid fixing radios in Queens, that version of him was gone, long buried. But maybe, just maybe, this wasn't about saving the world. Maybe it was just about ending the war. Oro 337. He moved the cursor, paused, and then he clicked Erase Orchard. The screen flickered. A progress bar appeared. 0%, 100%. And then black. No fanfare, no sounds, just finality, just peace. He stood up, unplugged the flash drive, crushed it beneath his boot. The man by the door didn't speak. He just watched Gio walk outside into the cold, into the silence, into the end of it all. No applause, no vengeance, no orchard, just trees, just sky. Just a life, once lived in fear, now walking free. Epilogue. 1 week later, in a federal data center in Virginia, an automated process was scheduled to trigger a series of information dumps. The script opened a folder called Casso Chain. Inside, nothing, deleted, emptied, gone. The system stalled for 2.4 seconds, then deactivated. Silently. No one noticed. No one ever would. Because some legacies aren't about being remembered. Some legacies are about finally being allowed to be forgotten.